J.W. Williams Funeral Directors have been proudly serving the people of this community since 1918. Service is our motto. The poor, the middle class, and all are given the best of care and attention at all times. You have the privilege to select what you want. In your time of need, contact the capable, the competent, and the dependable staff of the J.W. Williams Funeral Home who is genuinely concerned with your care. At J.W. Williams Funeral Home, you are aptly served by the proprietor president, Deacon Arthur L. Parker, who continues the traditions and values set forth by the past president, Dr. Napoleon Williams. Your announcers for the J.W. Williams Funeral Home Sunday morning program are Deacon Arthur L. Parker, Reverend Isaac H. Owens, Mrs. Calandra Wilkerson Parker, Minister Frankie Harmon, Miss Sandra Johnson, and Deacon Earl Clark, Jr.
I got that from there, okay. Yeah, I know you had told me that we had known. You're right, but you ain't know. Thank you, and good morning, friends. We come to you this morning to bring announcements, dedications, and songs. We certainly hope that your day may be brighter after listening to our program. The family of Mother Ida Bell Wellens Patrick of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Mr. Travis Nicholas Woodson, better known as Dirt Dog, of Vienna, Georgia. The family of Mr. Christopher Nolan Slappy of Plains, Georgia. The family of Mr. Sterling Thomas Lundy, better known as Duck, of Vienna, Georgia. The family of Miss Peggy Sue Harris of Americus, Georgia. The family of Mr. Willie Joe Howard Jr. of Lake City, Florida. The family of Elder Charles Edward Wilson of Cordele, Georgia, would like to thank their many friends for the food, the flowers, the condolences, and all other expressions of sympathy and kindness shown to them during their hours of sorrow and bereavement during the past week. Beloved church mother, Mother Ida Bell Wellens Patrick, age 96, of 509 West 18th Avenue, Cordele, Georgia, died Wednesday, January 4th, at her residence in Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for beloved church mother, Mother Ida Bell Wellens Patrick, age 96, was held Sunday, January 8th, at the A.S. Clark Auditorium on the M.D. White's Medical Institute campus in Cordele, Georgia. Her pastor, the Reverend Ivory J. Corbin, pastor of the Niles Chapel Baptist Church, officiated. The burial followed at the Gum Creek Church Cemetery in Cordele, Georgia. Survivors include 11 and devoted children, Mr. Benny L. Martin, Mrs. Annie R. Corbin, Mrs. Rita Patrick Bass, Mrs. Faye Patrick Luster and her husband, Mr. Vonnet Luster, Mr. Leonard Patrick and his wife, Mrs. Loretta Patrick, Mrs. Gail Patrick Staley, Deacon Reginald Patrick and his wife, Mrs. Lucretia Patrick, 17 beloved grandchildren, 17 great-grandchildren, 27 great-grandchildren, and other children she regarded as her own, a host of nieces and nephews, many cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive. Beloved church mother, Mother Ida Bell Wellens Patrick, age 96, 509 West 18th Avenue, Cordele, Georgia. Mr. Travis Nicholas Woodson, better known as Dirt Dog, age 51, 150 Chandler Road, Vienna, Georgia, died Monday, December 26th in Vienna, Georgia. The funeral service for Mr. Travis Nicholas Woodson, better known as Dirt Dog, age 51, was held Sunday, January 8th, on the grounds of the Pleasant Valley Baptist Church in Pinehurst, Georgia. Dr. Beverly Bolden, pastor. The eulogy was delivered by the Reverend Choice Cobb Sr., pastor of the Free Providence Baptist Church and the Spring Hill Baptist Church. The burial followed in the churchyard cemetery. Survivors include his devoted and beloved mother, Mrs. Shirley James Woodson of Vienna, Georgia. His loving and devoted sisters, Mrs. Shirley Ann James of Warner Robins, Georgia. Miss Shamara Woodson of Parrott, Georgia. His beloved brothers, Mr. Wayne Woodson of Plains, Georgia. Mr. Reed Woodson Jr. of Elko, Georgia. And Mr. Timothy Woodson and his wife, Mrs. Van Tressa Woodson of Warner Robins, Georgia. His beloved uncle, Mr. Joshua Woodson Sr. of Vienna, Georgia. His beloved aunt, Mrs. Bertha Woodson of Pinehurst, Georgia. A devoted cousin, Mrs. Betty McClendon of Vienna, Georgia. A host of nieces, nephews, cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends, to include his close friends, Mr. and Mrs. Frankie Lee Collier Jr. of Pinehurst, Georgia, Mr. Alonzo Adams of Cordele, Georgia, and Miss Cynthia Cotton of Vienna, Georgia, survived. Mr. Travis Nicholas Woodson, better known as Dirt Dog, age 51, of 150 Chandler Road, Vienna, Georgia. Mr. Christopher Nolan Slappy, age 49, of 209 Loop Road, Plains, Georgia, died Wednesday, January 4th, at the Phoebe Putney Memorial Hospital in Albany, Georgia. The funeral service for Mr. Christopher Nolan Slappy, age 49, was held Wednesday, January 11th, in the sanctuary of the Lebanon Baptist Church in Plains, Georgia. The pastor, the Reverend Christopher O'Brien, officiated. The eulogy was delivered by the Reverend George Frank Muntz. The burial followed at Lebanon Cemetery in Plains, Georgia. Survivors include his beloved and caring father, Mr. Henry Pope, his loving and caring sibling, Mrs. Martha Ann Harris, and her husband, the Reverend Gerald Harris of Leslie, Georgia. Miss Shamika Slappy of Plains, Georgia. Mr. Donnie Lewis of Americas, Georgia, Mr. Rodney Polk of Plains, Georgia, Mr. Mark Williams of New York, New York, and Miss Kathy Wilkerson of Americas, Georgia. His devoted aunts, Mrs. Maddie L. Thomas of Plains, Georgia, and Miss Jeanette Slappy of Albany, Georgia, Miss Gertrude Slappy of West Palm Beach, Florida, and Miss Deborah Pitts of Columbus, Georgia. His beloved uncles, Mr. Clarence Slappy of Americas, Georgia, Mr. Marvin Slappy and his wife, Mrs. Lorraine Slappy of Waterbury, Connecticut, and Mr. Artis Slappy and his wife, Mrs. Anita Slappy of Indiantown, Florida. A host of nieces, nephews, cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends, to include a devoted friend, Miss Barbara Hawkins, survived Mr. Christopher Nolan Slappy, age 49, of 209 Loop Road, Plains, Georgia. Mr. Starlin Thomas Lundy, better known as Duck, age 80, of 319 East Poplar Street, Vienna, Georgia, died Friday, January 6, at his residence in Vienna, Georgia. The funeral service for Mr. Starlin Thomas Lundy, better known as Duck, age 80, was held Thursday, January 12th, graveside at the Vienna City Cemetery in Vienna, Georgia. The Reverend Choice Cobb Sr., pastor of the Free Providence Baptist Church and the Spring Hill Baptist Church, officiated. Survivors include his loving and devoted children, Mr. Jerome Lundy, Mrs. Danita Brown, and her husband, Mr. Russell Brown, and Mr. Demetrius Passmore, all of Vienna, Georgia. 4 loving grandchildren, 2 of whom he reared as his own, Mrs. LaShonda Passmore of Vienna, Georgia, and Mr. Mike Passmore of Atlanta, Georgia. 6 great-grandchildren, 2 of whom he raised as his own, Jada and Mason. 1 beloved brother, Mr. Emerson Lundy of Vienna, Georgia. 1 sister, Mrs. Cheryl Lundy of Macon, Georgia. 5 sisters-in-law, Miss Mary's Lundy, Mrs. Mary Nell Lundy, Mrs. Linda Cobb, Mrs. Nadine Harvey, all of Vienna, Georgia, and Mrs. Shirley Lewis of Conroe, Georgia. A host of beloved nieces, nephews, great-nieces, great-nephews, in-law, cousins, and many, many sorrowing friends, to include 2 special nieces that was raised closely around him, Mrs. Mary Collier and her husband, Mr. Larry Collier, and Mrs. Cynthia Daniels and her husband, Mayor Eddie Daniels of Vienna, Georgia. And the shop boys all survived Mr. Starlin Thomas Lundy, better known as Duck, age 80, of 319 East Poplar Street, Vienna, Georgia. Miss Peggy Sue Harris, age 56, of 1605 Lafayette Street, Americas, Georgia, died Monday, January 9th, at the Phoebe Sumter Medical Center in Americas, Georgia. The funeral service for Miss Peggy Sue Harris, age 56, was held Friday, January 13th, in the sanctuary of the Bethesda Baptist Church in Americas, Georgia. The pastor, the Reverend Dr. Key Anthony Brooks, officiated. The burial followed at the Eastview Cemetery in Americus, Georgia. Survivors include her loving and devoted mother, Miss Velma Dean Harris of Americus, Georgia. Her beloved children, Miss Tina Jackson of McDonald, Georgia, Miss Crystal Reese of Americus, Georgia, and Mr. James Reese of Americus, Georgia. 11 beloved grandchildren, 2 great-grandchildren, 3 devoted brothers, Deacon Dwight Harris and his wife, Mrs. Victoria Harris of Americus, Georgia, Deacon Gregory Harris Sr. and his wife, Mrs. Stephanie Harris of Columbus, Georgia, and Mr. Ulysses Hopper of Americus, Georgia. 2 beloved sisters, Mrs. Barbara Green and her husband, Mr. Willie Green of Americus, Georgia, and Mrs. Diane Smith and her husband, Mr. William Smith of Americus, Georgia. Her sister-in-law, Miss Nina Hopper of Americus, Georgia. 7 beloved aunts, Mrs. Bertha May White and her husband, Mr. Otis White, and Miss Rena M. Walker, both of Americus, Georgia. Miss Dolores Baldwin of Aliquippa, Pennsylvania. Miss Lula May Harris of Americus, Georgia. Miss Beatrice Dent of Washington, D.C., Miss Grace Taylor of Capitol Heights, Maryland, and Miss Helen Schofield of Jacksonville, Florida. 3 beloved uncles, Mr. Anas Harris and his wife, Mrs. Betty Harris of Americus, Georgia, Mr. Eddie James Dean and his wife, Mrs. Betty Dean of Jacksonville, Florida, and Mr. Ulysses Dean and his wife, Mrs. Brenda Dean of Andersonville, Georgia. A host of beloved nieces, nephews, cousins, other relatives, and many friends, to include a devoted nephew, Mr. Kendrick Mathis, a loving cousin, Mrs. Earlene Russell, and a very special, loving friend, Miss Katrina Molden, survived Miss Peggy Sue Harris, age 56, of 1605 Lafayette Street, Americus, Georgia. Mr. Willie Joe Howard Jr., age 80, of 773 Southwest Ballast Lane, Lake City, Florida, died Monday, January 2nd, at the Baylor Point Nursing and Rehabilitation Center in Lake City, Florida. The funeral service for Mr. Willie Joe Howard Jr., age 80, was held Saturday, January 14th, in the sanctuary of the Pine City Baptist Church in Rochelle, Georgia. The Reverend Ernest Weaver, pastor, Deacon Lonnie Howard delivered the eulogy. The burial followed in the churchyard cemetery. Survivors include his loving and devoted children, Mrs. Gloria Jean Starr and Mr. Willie Joe Howard III, both of Lake City, Florida. His loving grandchildren, Miss Van Angela Reese, Miss Simone Moore, Mr. Jeremy Howard, Miss Jasmine Howard, Mr. Willie Joe Howard IV, Mr. Dontavius Starr, Miss Arcadia Starr, Miss Deja Howard, Mr. Andrew Howard, Mr. Nathan Howard, and Miss Juliana Howard. 12 beloved grandchildren. His loving and devoted sisters, Evangelist Willie May December of Fort Pierce, Florida, Mrs. Vivian Felt of East Point, Georgia, Miss Joanne Howard of Fort Pierce, Florida, a beloved brother, Mr. Oscar Howard, and his wife, Mrs. Cynthia Howard of Fort Pierce, Florida, a host of beloved nieces, nephews, cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive. Mr. Willie Joe Howard Jr., age 80, of 773 Southwest Baylor Lane, Lake City, Florida, formerly of Rochelle, Georgia. Elder Charles Edward Wilson, age 73, of 2325 Culpeper Road, Cordele, Georgia, died Monday, January 9th at the Chris Regional Hospital in Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Elder Charles Edward Wilson, age 73, was held Saturday, January 14th, in the sanctuary of the Ark of God Ministry in Cordele, Georgia. The pastor, Pastor David Johnson, delivered the eulogy. Co-pastor Cynthia Johnson officiated. The burial followed at the Sunnyside Cemetery in Cordele, Georgia. Survivors include his loving and devoted wife, Mrs. Lottie Denard Wilson of Cordele, Georgia, a beloved daughter, Miss Felicia Gadd, and her husband, Mr. Marvin J. Gadd, Sr. of Clarksburg, Maryland. One son, Mr. Xavier Ferguson of Rochelle, Georgia. 7 beloved grandchildren, 4 great-grandchildren, a beloved sister, Miss Mary E. Lane of Cordele, Georgia. 1 beloved brother, Mr. Curtis Wilson of Sacramento, California. His sisters-in-law, Mrs. Margaret Hudson, and her husband, Mr. Will Hudson, Miss Shirley Cross, and Mrs. Loretta Benjamin, and her husband, Mr. James Benjamin, all of Cordele, Georgia. His brothers-in-law, Mr. Eddie James Morgan of St. Petersburg, Florida. Mr. James F. Bell of Ashburn, Georgia, Mr. David Cross of Cordele, Georgia, Mr. James Cross of Atlanta, Georgia, and Mr. Robert Lee Cross of Cordele, Georgia. His beloved nieces and nephews, Mr. James Bell of Cordele, Georgia, Ms. Deidre Bell of Charleston, South Carolina, Ms. Delilah Brown, Ms. Shada Thomas Bell, Miss Shauna Davis, and Miss Nora Cross, all of Cordele, Georgia. Miss Marva Renee Lane of Augusta, Georgia, and Miss Donna Stone of Cincinnati, Ohio. A host of cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive. Elder Charles Edward Wilson, age 73, of 2325 Culpeper Road, Cordele, Georgia. Again, the family of beloved church mother, Mother Ida Bell Wellens Patrick of Cordele, Georgia, church mother of the Now Chapel Baptist Church. The family of Mr. Travis Nicholas Woodson, better known as Dirt Dog, of Vienna, Georgia. The family of Mr. Christopher Nolan Slappy of Plains, Georgia. The family of Mr. Starlin Thomas Lundy, better known as Duck, of Vienna, Georgia. The family of Miss Peggy Sue Harris of Americus, Georgia. The family of Mr. Willie Joe Howard Jr. of Lake City, Florida. The family of Elder Charles Edward Wilson of Cordele, Georgia, would like to thank their many friends for all of the many kindnesses shown to them during their hours of sorrow and bereavement during the past week. May God bless each of you is their prayer. The J.W. Williams Funeral Directors, serving Cordele and Diana, were in charge of each of these arrangements during the past week. And now, it is certainly with the deepest regret that we make the following announcements. Miss Lucille Cooper Farmer, age 57, 508 West 20th Avenue, Cordele, Georgia, died Monday, January 2nd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Survivors include 11 and devoted children, Ms. Hawata Cooper of Knoxville, Tennessee, Mr. Evangel Passmore and his wife, Mrs. Zelinda Passmore of Knoxville, Tennessee, and Miss April Cooper of Cordele, Georgia. Her 11 grandchildren, Miss Ebony Passmore, Miss Abria Passmore, Miss Jemiah Floyd, Mr. Irena Cooper, and Mr. Zatoria Fields Jr., a host of other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive. Miss Lucille Cooper Farmer, age 57, 508 West 20th Avenue, Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Miss Lucille Cooper Farmer, age 57, will be held today, Sunday, January 15th at 1 p.m. graveside at the Bethel Cemetery in Cordele, Georgia. Pastor Diane Dean will officiate. Mother Annie Lou Harris Beal, affectionately known as Baby Doll, age 94, of 801 West 15th Avenue, Cordele, Georgia, died Tuesday, January 10th at her residence in Cordele, Georgia. Survivors include her loving and caring children, Mrs. Carolyn Thomas, Stuart Payton Beal Jr. and his wife, Mrs. April Beal, Mrs. Emma Jean Mobley, Mr. Willie Frank Beal and his wife, Mrs. Verdell Beal, Mr. Ernest Beal, Mrs. Patricia Beal Cross, Mrs. Betty Barnes Martin, and Mrs. Dorothy Barnes Miller. 10 beloved grandchildren, 21 great-grandchildren, her loving and devoted sisters, Mrs. Lucille Johnson of Cleveland, Ohio, Mrs. Maddie Stewart of Irvine, California, and Miss Estella Hunter of Macon, Georgia. A sister-in-law, Miss Alatrice Harris of Macon, Georgia. A host of devoted nieces, nephews, cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive. Mother Annie Lou Harris Beal, affectionately known as Baby Doll, age 94, of 801 West 15th Avenue, Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Mother Annie Lou Harris Beal affectionately known as Baby Doll, will be held Tuesday, January 17th at 12 noon at the A.S. Clark Auditorium on the campus of the M.D. White's Medical Institute in Cordele, Georgia. The Reverend Andrew Thomas, pastor of the Shady Grove CME Church, will officiate. The Reverend Sadie Jackson will deliver the eulogy. The burial will follow at the Macedonia Church Cemetery in Vienna, Georgia. The public visitation will be Monday, January 16th from 1 until 5 p.m. at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home. North 7th Street, Cordele, Georgia, died Saturday, January 14th, 2023, at the Chris Regional Hospital in Cordele, Georgia. Survivors include her loving and devoted children, Mrs. Loretta Raines and her husband, Mr. Arthur Raines, Mrs. Marva Sabrina Williams, Mr. Jackie Singleton, and Miss Teresa Ford, and a host of other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive. Miss Angeline Williams of Cordele, Georgia. Mr. Anthony Taylor, age 58, better known as Dog Pound of Cordele, Georgia, died early this morning at the Chris Regional Hospital in Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Mr. Anthony Taylor, better known as Dog Pound, age 58, will be announced at a later date pending the completion of the arrangements. The J.W. Williams Funeral Directors serving Cordele and Vienna are in charge of each of these arrangements during this week. Friends, that conclude our funeral notices for this morning. As always, we do remind you concerning our pre-funeral arrangements planning available at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home, with packages available with a single pay, a 3-year pay, a 5-year pay, and a 10-year pay. So please stop by and talk with us concerning your pre-funeral arrangements needs available at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home. And also, whole life insurance is available at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home.
And now for announcements. The Zion Hope Missionary Baptist Church invites everyone to their installation service for its pastor, Pastor Mathis K. Wright, which will be held today, Sunday, January 15th at 2:00 p.m. Dr. Douglas W. Kearse will be the speaker. Mother Betty Ingram will give the congratulatory message to the pastor. Reverend Mathis K. Wright is the pastor. The McAfee Grove Baptist Church, located at Highway 19 in Leesburg, Georgia, invites everyone to worship with them during their family night worship services. Tuesday night at 7:00 p.m., you are invited to worship with them. And then on Thursday nights at 7:00 p.m. for their small class study. You may join them on Sunday mornings at 9:00 a.m. for worship services, and you may join them by using the call-in number 425-436-6341. Again, that number is 425-6341. The access code is 708058. Reverend Dr. Robert L. Morgan Sr. is the pastor. The Crisp County Cougars, Crisp County High School class of 1978 reunion committee will meet on Saturday, February 4th at Blackshear Place to discuss plans for the reunion. Everyone in participating graduating members is asked to please attend this meeting on Saturday, February the 4th, that will be held at Blackshear Place. And I don't have a time for the meeting, but you may contact any member of the committee to get a time for this meeting. The Spring Hill Baptist Church of Tippyville Family and Friends Day will be today, Sunday, January 15th at 11:00 a.m. Everyone is invited to attend. Masks and social distancing is required. Sister Mary Ann Lewis, Secretary, Deacon Calvin Youngblood, Chairman, Reverend Choice Cobb Sr. is the pastor. The Mount Moriah Church of Unadilla will have installation service for its pastor, Brother Edward Lester, on Sunday, February the 5th at 2:00 p.m. Dinner will be served. Sister Linda Jordan, Mission President, Brother Earl Jordan, Chairman of Deacons, Brother Edward Lester is the pastor. Everyone has a cordial invitation to worship with the Greater Mars Tabernacle Baptist Church. You may join them for Sunday school beginning at 9:00 a.m. Worship service begins at 10:00 a.m. Conference call schedule, you may join them via Facebook Live at 9:00 a.m. Tuesday, midday prayer conference at 12:00 noon. Thursday, prayer meeting and Bible study is held at 6:00 p.m. The call-in number for the conference call is 229-329-7611. Deacon Arthur L. Parker is the chairman of deacons. Reverend Dr. K.M. Williams is the pastor. Everyone has a cordial invitation to worship at the St. King Baptist Church during their worship service, which begins at 10:15 a.m. Reverend Woody Burnham is the pastor. The Mount Zion First African Baptist Church conference call schedule Sunday morning begins at 10:00 a.m. Prayer Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. 5:00 p.m. The call-in number is 339-209-6419. Deacon Joe Wedges, chairman of deacons. Reverend Dr. Dan James III is the pastor. Everyone has a cordial invitation to worship at the Gethsemane Baptist Church today. Worship service begins at 10:30 a.m. Mother Mary S. Butler is the church mother. Deacon Johnny Wilson, chairman of deacons. Reverend Cecil Straughter is the pastor. The New Oak Grove Baptist Church invites everyone to worship with them each Sunday, with Sunday school beginning at 9:15 a.m. and worship service at 10 o'clock a.m. On Saturday, January 21st, beginning at 10:30 a.m., the New Oak Grove Baptist Church will have a clothing giveaway. They encourage you to come by and shop and look for clothes that you would like. You are asked to please bring your own bag. Deacon Alonzo Jones is the chairman of deacons. Reverend W.W. Wilson is the pastor. Straight Life Church of God Pentecostal of Cordial will have Family and Friends Day on Sunday, January 29th, beginning at 9:30 a.m. Bishop Fred M. Williams is the pastor. Everyone has a cordial invitation to worship at the Mount Calvary Baptist Church today during its annual Family Day service, which will begin this morning at 10:30 a.m. You may join them for Sunday school at 9:45 a.m. The Honorable Judge Victoria Darasol will be the guest speaker. Sister Linda G. Rollins, Family Day chairperson. Deacon Leon Spears, chairman of deacons. Reverend Isaac H. Owens is the pastor. The Albany, Georgia Alumni Chapter Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated will have a soup, socks, and hats giveaway on Monday, January 16th from 10 a.m. until 12 o'clock noon at the Mount Calvary Baptist Church Annex building located in Cordial, Georgia. Everyone is asked to stop by and join them during this time. The Albany Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Wilcox County Head Start is offering free child development services for eligible families with children between the ages of 3 and 5. For more information, please contact Mrs. Donna Jenkins at 229-365-2341 or 478-922-4464. The Cordial Crisp County branch of the NAACP announces the activities for the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. holiday for 2023. The theme for this year's celebration is Together We Can Be the Dream. The events will begin with the annual fellowship breakfast hosted by American Legion Post 542, and it will begin at 7:30 a.m. The parade march will assemble on 24th Avenue at the Old Harvey's parking lot, where we will assemble for the parade, and the assembly time will begin at 8 o'clock, and that the kickoff for the parade will begin at 9:30. The parade will travel the Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, cross the Clemmy C. Gaston Memorial Bridge, and go over to the old Crisp County Middle School auditorium. At that time, we will have the fellowship service that will begin at 11 o'clock a.m. Dr. Nelson Maynard III, a native of Cordial, will deliver the keynote address. Special music will be provided by the MLK Chorale, consisting of choirs of the Cordial churches and surrounding area churches. Everyone has a cordial invitation to come out and share in this very special day of events honoring the life of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on tomorrow, beginning at 7:30 a.m. with the fellowship breakfast. For more information, please contact any member of the local branch of the NAACP. That will conclude our announcements for today. And just as we conclude, I'd like to take this opportunity to wish a very special happy birthday to our youngest son, John, who celebrated his birthday on yesterday. That concludes our announcements for today.
And now for dedication. Our first selection this morning is dedicated to the following in loving memory of Mrs. Mamie Blackburn, who departed this life January 2020. Dedication requested by all of her children, grandchildren, the Marsh Tabernacle Baptist Church, her pastor, Dr. Kim Williams, and Deacon Tommy Ford Jr., gone but not forgotten. In loving memory of Mrs. Sadie Singleton, who departed this life January 13, 1982, dedication requested by her beloved family, gone but not forgotten. In loving memory of Mrs. Eva Pearl Gaston, who would have celebrated her birthday January 14th. Dedication requested by the Gaston family. Precious memory lingers still. In loving memory of Mother Hattie M. Mathis, who would have celebrated her birthday January 15th. Dedication requested by her beloved daughter, Dr. Ruby Jackson, and the entire family. Gone but not forgotten. In loving memory of Mr. Johnny Tarbert Sr. for Mrs. Juanita Tarbert, who would have celebrated their 57th anniversary January 15th. Dedication requested by the Tarbert and Mathis family. In loving memory of Mrs. Mamie Rose Royal, who departed this life January 12th, 2012, and would have celebrated her birthday January 18th. Dedication requested by the entire Royal and Ford family and the members of the Greater Morris Tabernacle Baptist Church, where she served as clerk for many, many years. Pastor Dr. K.M. Williams, Deacon Tommy Ford Jr., her brother, and the entire membership. In loving memory of Mr. Emmanuel Cleveland, who would have celebrated his birthday January 20th, and who departed this life January 23rd, 2012. Dedication requested by the Cleveland family. Gone but not forgotten. Our first selection this morning is dedicated to the following. Happy birthday to Miss Barbara Dennis, who celebrated her birthday Saturday, January 7th. Dedication requested by her beloved husband, Brother Johnny Dennis, the children, grandchildren, her sister, her brothers, and the entire McGill and Dennis family. Happy birthday to Deacon William O. Durham and his twin brother, Mr. Walter O. Durham, who celebrated their birthday Monday, January 9th. Happy birthday to my brother, the Honorable Judge Chief Master Sergeant Norman Dexter, who celebrated his birthday Thursday, January 12th. Dedication requested by his wife, Dr. Gwendolyn Mike Singh, Dexter's children, the entire family, management, and staff of the J.W. Williams Funeral Home. Happy birthday to Mr. Pete Dennis, who is celebrating his birthday today. Happy birthday to Mr. Benjamin Carter, who is celebrating his birthday today. Happy birthday to my mother-in-law, Mrs. Billy Ann Hall, who will celebrate her birthday on Monday, January 16th. Dedication requested by our daughter, Miss Calandra Wilkerson Parker, her grandson, Jai Wilkerson Parker, and Karinsky Wilkerson. Happy birthday to Chairman Deacon Sammy McGill, who will celebrate his birthday Monday, January 16th. Happy birthday to Mr. Willie Colson, who will celebrate his birthday Monday, January 16th. Special birthday wishes goes out to Mrs. Deborah Pless of Americus, Georgia, who will celebrate her birthday on January 17th. Happy birthday to Miss Karen Hughes, who will celebrate her birthday Tuesday, January 17th. And happy birthday to Mrs. Renee Kellogg Bill, who will celebrate her birthday Friday, January 20th. It is certainly with the deepest regret that we make the following announcement. Miss Lucille Cooper Farmer, age 57, 508 West 20th Avenue, Cordele, Georgia, died Monday, January 20th in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The funeral service for Mrs. Lucille Farmer Cooper will be held today, Sunday, January 15th at 1 p.m. graveside at the Bethel Cemetery in Cordele, Georgia. The Reverend Pastor Diane Dean will officiate. Mother Annie Lou Harris Bill, affectionately known as Baby Doll, age 94, of 801 West 15th Avenue, Cordele, Georgia, died Tuesday, January 10th at her residence in Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Mother Annie Lou age 94 will be held Tuesday, January 17th at 12 noon at the A.S. Clark Auditorium on the campus of the M.D. White's Institute. The Reverend Andrew Thomas, pastor the Shady Grove CME Church, will officiate. The eulogy will be delivered by the Reverend Sadie Jackson. The burial will follow at the Macedonia Church Cemetery in Vienna, Georgia. Miss Angeline Williams, age 83, of 612 West 9th Avenue, Cordele, Georgia, died Saturday, January 14th at the Chris Regional Hospital in Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Miss Angeline Williams will be announced at a later date, pending the completion of the arrangement. Mr. Anthony Taylor, better known as Dog Pound, age 58, of Cordele, Georgia, died early this morning at the Chris Regional Hospital in Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Mr. Anthony Taylor, better known as Dog Pound, age 58, will be announced at a later date, pending the completion of the arrangements. The J.W. Williams The J.W. Williams Funeral Director serving Cordele and Vienna are in charge of each of these arrangements during this week. Our next and final selection for this morning is dedicated to the bereaved families whose loved ones were laid to rest during the past week. The family of Mother Ida Bell Wellens Patrick of Cordele, Georgia, church mother, the Now Chapel Baptist Church. The family, Mr. Travis Nicholas Woodson, better known as Dirt Dog, of Vienna, Georgia. The family, Mr. Christopher Nolan Slappy of Plains, Georgia. The family, Mr. Starlin Thomas Lundy, better known as Duck, of Vienna, Georgia. The family, Miss Peggy Sue Harris of Americus, Georgia. The family, Mr. Willie Joe Howard Jr. of Lake City, Florida. The family of Elder Charles Edward Wilson of Cordele, Georgia. This selection is dedicated to the bereaved families whose loved ones will be laid to rest during this week. The family, Miss Lucille Cooper Farmer of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Mother Annie Lou Harris Beal of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Miss Angeline Williams of Cordele, Georgia. And the family of Mr. Anthony Taylor, better known as Dog Pound, of Cordele, Georgia. This selection is dedicated to all of the sick and shut in, to all patients in the local and surrounding hospitals, nursing homes, and rehabilitation centers, to our beloved ministers and their devoted family members, to all retired educators, to the men and women serving in our armed forces, both stateside and abroad, to all veterans, and to everyone who listens to our program on each Sunday morning. It's a pleasure for us to bring it to you. Our program goes out in memory of our past president, Dr. Napoleon Williams, to my wife, Mrs. Calandra Wilkerson Parker, to my son, Jai Wilkerson Parker, and to my mother-in-law again, who's celebrating her birthday on tomorrow. Say happy birthday to Mrs. Billy Ann Hall. Goes out to my brother, retired Chief Master Sergeant Norman F. Dexter, who celebrated his birthday during this past week. Say happy birthday to Deacon Norman Dexter and to his wife, Dr. Gwendolyn Maxine Dexter, and her grandson, Noble. To my sister, Miss Patsy Jackson, and her husband, Mr. Jim Jackson. It goes out to my nephew, Deacon Kenneth Smith, program chairman of the Greater Morris Tabernacle Missionary Baptist Church, to our pastor, Dr. K.M. Williams, and his wife, Sister Kathy Williams. And selection goes out again to each and everyone who listens to our program on each Sunday morning. It's a pleasure for us to bring it to you. And we do encourage everyone to come out on tomorrow in observance of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. celebration that will be hosted by the local chapter of the NAACP here in Cordele, Georgia on tomorrow. God bless you.
Thank you for joining us this morning. We hope you've enjoyed our program. Tune in again on next Sunday morning. Remember, in your time of need, contact the competent, capable, and dependable staff at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home.